The idea of taking responsibility, self-responsibility, claiming the things that happen to you that are horrible, that you don't want to be in the situation that you are in, are indeed faults of your own, that you've ended up in this situation. That is all considered part of a society which prides itself upon trying to claim, well, you, the victim, are actually merely complaining, when in reality there's nothing to complain about, and the system is completely in place, that favors everyone equally, it's all fair, and it's not biased against you or biased against any single group. This is because they believe that it's all equality, and people who really want true egalitarianism, well, they've already got it, and that you can't really advocate for it at this point, because it's already been achieved. Of course, this comes with this pre-established presumption that inequality hasn't gone away, that society is better now than it is in the past. I mean, not in the social sphere. Even these are the kind of people to admit that, the so-called anarcho-capitalists, but it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant when they think about the social sphere. It's all about the economic sphere. Because when we're not talking about, for instance, the people that form the nation, we're talking about how the people cooperate with the state, how the government is bonded to the people that comprise its territory. What is the relationship between the groups and the judgment makers, those who make decisions, and those who prosecute those who disobey the laws the government has set down, some of which are even imprinted in the Constitution. And yes, people hold the Constitution with very high value, even more than something actually valuable, such as the Declaration of Independence. But enough about the Declaration of Independence, as even though it's important to be independent and not a colony, it's not like any American ever upholds this value. It's all about the constitutional values, and that's where the real debate comes in. It's got nothing to do with imperialism and the basis of having an independent state. Independence, things people fight for, things that people fight for within their nation, certain aspects of a country they can't uphold. No, it's just constitutional stuff, things that contradict one another, things that are considered rather conservative and traditionalist, according to the same people who believe that a new society with civilization, with industrialism, pollution, is somehow going to take us back to the old days, that old industrial age kind of look, that industrial age kind of feel. You have to have an economy, in my opinion, that mimics the old days in order to really have the people that mimic the old days. That really says how it's going down in the context of the United States, due to the fact that you need to motivate people into doing something in order for them to do it, rather than them naturally coming towards the conclusion that, well, maybe it's best that we change something since something's clearly broken. No, you need to liberate people. And this is because we don't live in a society where people are willing to take steps in order to create real utopias. They slum around and they don't actually do anything. They stay in societies that they clearly hate without even advocating for change, really, or to say, well, I'm so oppressed. And you're right, you are oppressed. But you're not really doing anything to fix that, is my problem. And so, in order to even fix something, you have to identify what the problem is. Who is the enemy that is oppressing you? Who is the enemy in general? The rival, the one who chains you up and enslaves you? And well, the answer is simply, and it's always been the answer since pretty much the dawn of a state's existence, the state. A government. A body which governs people. Because it's not the community, it's not the individuals who make up a society, a group, a collective, who govern. It's either one person, a dictator, or a bunch of people. And that is a problem. Because when you give so much power to so few people, well, a society falls apart. Because you got the government doing things against the will of the people, despite their best efforts to stop it. And they can't. They'll be killed. A lot of countries are actually prosecuted for daring to criticize the government. You have to understand this neglect of state, this resentment of any government, any form of ruling that is not by the people, for the people, in which a population, a group, a collective, a team are treated equally, are given with equal power, equal authority, equal control over one another. It's coming from a former self-proclaimed fascist and capitalist. Never an anarcho-capitalist, however, as libertarianism and fascism don't mix very well. If anything, they're pretty much the opposite thing, but opposite ideologies. It's just that when I was a fascist, and I call myself a fascist, and I cared very much about the quality of life of the citizens in my country, right? My ideal, perfect country. That was also when I cared about the same labor laws that, modern-day capitalists proclaim are perfect for the economy. Privatization, no interference with the economy, which was clearly a contradiction to fascist authoritarian ideology, so they don't really seem to mix. However, on the contrary, libertarian socialism does mix very well. It does not contradict, and it does not fault, based exclusively upon the inherent nature of the ideology. What it means to be a libertarian socialist, or, in my case, an anarcho-socialist, is somebody who advocates for the abolishment of a government. Instead, social engineering, social cohesion, and the fate of a nation lying entirely in the hands of the people who are the ones who build it, are the ones who bring it together, are the ones who pretty much collect food for it. I mean, they do everything for it. The government of every single country in the world aren't doing that. They're not the ones that actually help society. It's all the people. And of course the government can't. They're a small body of people. This is why I advocate for everyone to have equal authority in a country. The means of production go to the workers, the community. With state socialism, it's where the government controls the means of production, meaning that they can stop exploitation and set certain quotas and measures that prevent people from being overpaid and people from being underpaid. In the context of social cohesion, there's such a strong bond between members of, in this case, the same race, because this is an ethnocentric thing. People, say for instance, of European descent, who, because they share a similarity, and they're all proud of that, and they all agree it's a great thing, and that they should be proud of their Europeanness, they will help one another out. It's the same with taxation. It's all got to do with reinforcing other people's benefits, other people's expenses. Okay, all the things that they need that come with living within a successful, wealthy, economically flourishing society. They pay for one another because they have such a strong bond. And that's not a bond based upon lumping a bunch of people that have nothing to do with one another together. They share similarities, ideological similarities, irreligious or religious similarities, biological similarities, such as racial and ethnic similarities, cultural similarities, linguistical similarities, so forth. They're united by a language, this body of people, that forms a nation, that forms a proper, independent state. However, in terms of the state as in government, there is none. See, the means of production go to the workers because the workers look out for one another. And if they find out that somebody is not serving under the rules, the practically social constitutional rules that have been established, the social laws, not systematically enforced ones, then they are exiled, or, imprisoned, because this is a society that still has capitalism. I mean, after all, we're talking about economic trade and setting up business and, well, you get the idea of buying things. That is a society with capitalism, but it's still socialist, because as opposed to state socialism, it is we'll just call it community socialism, okay? In which the workers own the means of production. The libertarian part means that aside from the fact that we are setting up certain social rules that prevent exploitation and people from managing their own businesses as they would where they pretty much sack their workers or pay them at minimum or practically non-existent wages, pretty mumuch just exploit them, waste their time, give them barely any pay for heaps of work, pull schemes pretty much, they can get away with all this terrible stuff, like a lot of big corporations and business companies in America can, due to the laissez-faire freedom, apparent economic freedom, emphasis on freedom because there's nothing free about it, people being exploited, people becoming miserable due to the terrible schemes big companies pull on their employees, on the employers and everybody in between, their customers especially, who suffer the most due to their terrible actions, and goddamn, they need to be sued for the horrible things they do. The community stops exploitation, as opposed to the state. We consider the libertarian part, which means that aside from that, everything else is incredibly lenient. There's no strict fascist, authoritarian, hyper-statist laws, right? None of that stuff. Statism, not a thing. Completely against that, ideologically and socially, alright? So what happens here is that there is no statism. There is a very libertarian, free society based upon an idea of liberty that comes with not being exploited by a certain business, a certain corporation, or just by a certain person who opens up their own independent business. So there's no such thing as private ownership, but in terms of public ownership, we're not referring to state ownership, we're merely referring to worker ownership, community ownership. Everybody owns the same things. What you own, I own. There's no private property, because we all like one another, and we all share a bond. Now you may think, well, that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, you can't get everybody to like one another, but you can. This is how tribes were formed. People had certain similarities and beliefs about one another, all positive, which led them to band together to create something much bigger. I think we need to go back to that tribalist kind of time. I'm just going to call it neo-tribalism. That's the ideology itself. And this ideology, this very ethnocentric ideology, people of any race, people of any ethnicity, people of any ethnic cluster, they can all appreciate it, they can all do their own variant of it, because it's not bound by a certain group of people. It's to each their own, and every single person has the right to participate in this, to form their own tribes and be with the people they love, their own people, those they share a blood bond with. But unfortunately, in modern Western times, people have forgotten such values completely. They've forgotten honor, they've forgotten dignity, and they've instead embraced insanity and depravity. One of these various examples is this undying loyalty to the state. You can't be disobedient to the state. No. This is an appeal to authority, pretty much a law of the land fallacy, in which just because something is legal, according to people, certain statists, certain self-proclaimed fascists, because a law exists, therefore, you must abide by it, and if you don't abide by it, well, guess what? You're immoral, and so is everyone else that dare goes on strike, dare asks for equal rights, equal payment, equal earnings, for more work they put in than somebody who just got lucky. Maybe they stumbled across the lucky lottery ticket, and they won $10 billion. That's not fair. It should be based upon your effort. I believe that somebody's earnings should be determined by how much effort they put into their job, and that they're doing a very productive job that works for the economy. Not somebody who gets rich just because they do, because heaps of people flock to buy their albums or their books or, well, whatever they make. I don't know, maybe they make films. Maybe they're just some idiot who gambles away their money, and one day they got lucky, and guess what? They're successful now. It's truly disgusting, the unfair capitalist structure that is only existent due to the state. Every single state of every single country across the world. Even in great countries like Japan, this is still a prevalent problem. And income equality, I believe, at least in the United States, is only getting worse. It's gotten worse, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. Disparities between the rich and the poor are not determined by value that somebody has to bring into this world, into the economy. It's determined by luck, by appeal to popularity, and by no means of actual energy put into one's work. Just the fact that, oh well, you happen to be the lucky one. You succeeded not because of your own merit, as you should in a true meritocracy, a true egalitarian society, but you succeeded because other people sucked you off. Not that they should, but they did. Congratulations. And that's pretty much capitalism for you. Unlike authoritarianism, socialism is not impressive, because even though it does force the employers of a certain company, any sort of business really, to comply to the community's will, or in some cases the state's will, it doesn't violate anybody's rights. It is not a right for you to exploit your customers. It is not a right for you to exploit your employees. It is not a right for you to lie to your audience, your demographics, the people that come to buy from your restaurants, to purchase items from your store, and every single kind of business that there is, any single occupation that you can get paid for, or even ones you can't get paid for, because this is about forming good relationships amongst people who share a bond with you, a blood bond, an ideological bond, all that kind of stuff, you're ruining that relationship. You're poisoning the well by not complying to the basic rules established by a society based upon harmony, trust, and loyalty. With authoritarianism, nobody benefits. Let's say, for instance, I ban prostitution. Okay, who benefits from that? The prostitutes lose money. The people who want to, get their dicks sucked, they're not going to get their dicks sucked. They're not going to get laid. Because, well, they can't get anything out of it because it's not legal. The prostitution doesn't exist then because it's just something people would like to have, but they can't. Because, the government likes to take away things that are fun on the basis of trying to prevent STDs and all that. It's all about that quality of life at the expense of human happiness. See, with exploitation, who is really winning? Nobody. Nobody at all. You could say that the person exploiting their workers are winning, but that's not something that you should be proud of doing. That's not something you should be illegally allowed to do. In the context of a community, you should be exiled, possibly imprisoned for such behavior, pulling such schemes. So fascism and socialism are completely different. Exploiting your workers, terrible. Banning something completely harmless, terrible. You understand? Simply making it illegal to make horrible stunts, to not take your business seriously, to have zero ethics, to worsen the relationship between people living under the same flag, the same establishment of creed and honor. Well, that's just disgusting. This is what capitalists believe, that it's somehow wrong to regulate businesses because it's state intervention, or it's community-driven intervention. And that is apparently violating people's rights. It is not violating anybody's rights. The only rights that are being violated is that of the employees and the customers, by the employers, by those, the capitalists, who sit in their high chairs and make money off of the poor. They don't give any of that money back. They don't redistribute it. No, they vote for the Republican Party, and it just makes things worse. Goes downhill from there on, and the economic divide between rich and poor keeps getting larger, to the point now where nothing is fair. Nobody's making a fair wage based upon their effort. It's all either luck, or well, you're completely poor. Fortune, misfortune, nothing whatsoever about merit. To explain why I gravitated towards anarchism, I'll have to give an idea of how bad the state is. But not just one idea. There are plenty criticisms that anybody of any ideology can draw up, including fascists themselves who, at some points, have been oppressed by the state. In fact, in Germany right now, they are oppressed because freedom of speech isn't something allowed in Germany. And while I don't really agree with freedom of speech in the context of a social sphere, I think people should all believe the same thing and say the same thing, because they truly agree with an ideology, with ideological principles, values, beliefs, and so forth, all that kind of moral stuff. There is no real law against thinking differently or holding different opinions. It's just about public display. That is, in Germany. Seeing that there are no quotas whatsoever, no standards for people to believe something, which is a problem, unlike Nazi Germany, which had strong beliefs, which had strong morals. Germany has inherently become a fascist state of its own, abandoning any real German values in favor for multiculturalism and multiracialism and, well, things that don't make its citizens happy. In fact, it makes them quite miserable. I'll have to give you multiple justifications as to why there shouldn't be a state. And of course, if you want a state, that's great. Each to their own. I don't support imperialism. I support everybody getting what they want. But for me, and for many, many like me, we don't want a state. We don't want any form of government. If we are to be governed, then we're being governed by every single person equally. I would have just as much authority as the person next to me, or anyone. A bit like a posse rounding up and lynching a rapist or a murderer, there was no government in doing that. This is why vigilante groups exist. Seeing they were more successful than police officers or anything employed by the state, any arguments in regards to, well, it's just not going to work as well, is actually counteracted by the fact that it worked better in the past. And when you think of something like the death penalty, which, by the way, I don't actually support, I support life imprisonment instead, most deaths in reaction to violence committed by a perpetrator, their deaths, the deaths of the perpetrators, it's mostly by vigilantes rather than the state. In In fact, the state barely executes anybody, with the exception of maybe, the People's Republic of China, but that's just an exception. In the context of America and pretty much every other country, it's usually just vigilante groups. Since moderate political parties seem practically inseparable to me, since they both just advocate for more state control of an already incredibly statist society, which would do anything but actually regulate businesses that will pull schemes that will not abide by good ethics, they don't have any of my interest. They don't care about policing the actual bad things or the things that will eventually inevitably happen for a lot of big corporations. They care to reinforce his corporations, advertisements for them, all these commercials, all these promotions of their products and their businesses and their people and their managers. It's not of my interest, all this capitalist constructionism. If anything, a deconstruction of the establishment would be a lot better. But of course, I advocate for community control over the means of production. The community regulates it, not the state. Though I will accept the state as a lesser evil because since you already have a government, you best off at least put it to good use. So here are 10 reasons, the top 10 reasons why the state needs to fall. For number 10, I want to pick an historical atrocity. This one committed by the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany during World War II. It was the rape of Berlin. When the Red Army invaded Berlin, as the Soviet Union was an entirely imperialistic nation and empire, preceding the original Russian Empire and colonizing Eastern Europe, it entered Central Western Europe, Germany, and started raping all the women who lived in the villages nearby the rural towns, the offskirts of the main metropolitan city of Berlin. Women who were in the center were usually fine, but outside of that, in the less safeguarded areas of the city, hundreds of thousands of rapes took place, to the point where, by the end of World War II, it was estimated a total of 2 million individual German women have been raped, some of which were raped 60 to 70 times repeatedly by multiple Russian troops. This is because the decision of the Soviet Union was not to avoid war crimes. It had nothing to do with ethics or keeping clean from human rights violations, no. All they cared about was being able to conquer Germany the same way that the United States didn't want Germany to exist in its current form, the same for the United Kingdom, as the Allies all poured in. And at no point did any of the Allies stop the Soviet Union from doing this. It just went on. Few people actually know about this today, disgustingly, because it's been swept under the rug by the United States government, alongside the government of Germany, which would rather focus on the idea of a Holocaust rather than an actual, rape-related Holocaust, more specifically because it will misinterpret certain historical events and then push that as a narrative to say that the actions of Germany were evil, as opposed to the actions of those invading Germany. For number 2, I pick the Holodomor, also known as the Ukrainian Genocide. The Ukrainian Genocide was a man-made famine by Joseph Stalin, lasting from 1932 to 1933, far before the apparent Holocaust in Germany. In Ukraine, the peasants were forced to labor against their will under the control of the Soviet Union, when Russia had taken over Ukraine, officially capturing its borders and securing its government as its own. Now, having claimed this territory, they were put to work under horrible working conditions, long hours, and extremely little pay. Pretty much enslaved by the Soviets, they slowly died off as starvation set in, alongside a lack of resources to live one's life. In relation to this famine, death tolls all over the place. Some begin with 3.3 million, others 3.9 million, another would be 6.1 million, and to list a few others, 7.5 million, 10 million, 20 million, and 7 million. Also, there's one claiming 6 million died. However, none of these statistics really give a good idea, due to the fact that we didn't have many statistics at the time to determine how many people died. There wasn't really a consensus on Ukraine due to the fact that the Soviet government never took one. Although Joseph Stalin was the one to organize the Holodomor, Lazar Kavanovich was the one to stay by it and actually take care of Ukraine while the famine was occurring. He was the one who managed the economy, the stock trade, the economic boundaries between Ukraine, Russia, and other financial entities in Europe. Accompanied by the Jewish bourgeoisie, they were the keepers of order in the nation. Not order as in a good economic policy, or the citizens of Ukraine being able to eat now and then. No. He kept things in line, broke the strikes and the protests, and stopped such things from happening. The Ukrainian nationalists, who had a Ukrainian identity, very distinct and Eastern European, was being broken by the Soviet imperialists, particularly by the Jewish bourgeoisie, which hated any form of national identity, especially if it were a European one. Many of the members linked to old world Zionist organizations. They tried to destroy the original image of Ukraine, the indigenous image, with an empire, with a colonial colony amongst Europe, trying to say that it's nothing special, that it has no pride to take in itself. Socially oppressed, economically oppressed, the Ukrainians kept dying. Once Ukraine gained independence, it took it years and years to recover from the famine. And to this day, Ukraine happens to be one of the poorest countries in all of Europe. Truly, a beautiful Aryan people, their identity crushed by the racism of the Jews. For number 8 on this list, I choose the war on drugs. Not that the war on drugs is a war. I'm aware that there are a bunch of civil conflicts that occur in many countries relating to drug trafficking, and the fact that because it's legal under the rule of the government that owns these countries, well, because of this, there is endless homicides that are stacking up every year. And it only seems to be getting worse as when you make something illegal, people are more likely to do it then, because they like to rebel against a system that is unfair, cruel, unjust in every single manner, and through prohibited activities that don't need to be prohibited to begin with. This is the idea of fascism, the political philosophy which binds together outlawing completely harmless things, only because they're harmful to the users that use them. The term war simply just means a list of conflicts, particularly in Mexico, which seems to be struck the hardest. However, there are endless arrests in the United States, meaning that drug trafficking and simple harmless drug use is responsible for a fair portion of the nation's incarceration rate, as opposed to actual bad crimes, things that harm others. Because the government is so obsessed with what people do to their own bodies in their own private homes, it goes out of its way to arrest millions of people and throw them in jail. Now, at no point am I saying that drug use is healthy for you, with the exception of marijuana, which actually has many health benefits to the point where it can actually be used as a medical herb. But I am saying that what people do in their own space, the fact that they're not actually harming anyone else, and it's entirely their body and their choice to do such a thing, that shouldn't concern the government. It shouldn't concern the government what people do when it does not affect their systematic ruling. The entire reason that drugs are prohibited to begin with is because when something is made a crime and people are arrested for said crime, the government can choose between one of the two options for the individual who is caught. One, they pay a large fine, or two, they spend heaps of time in jail. And for those who pay a large fine, the government receives money. And due to this, and due to all the amount of money going to the government, they are profiting off of the people's misery. However, this doesn't even seem to really work for the government, due to the fact that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year on employing police officers and military personnel to dispatch of drug dealers and sellers. This is one of the worst human rights atrocities in the world, since it's occurring all over the globe. Every single continent has been struck by this, and there are very few countries in the world that have any legality for weed, or any other drugs for that matter, not as though any of them should be illegalized. For number 7, every single economic recession, every single cash crash in history, every single time the economy has drastically failed due to inflation rising. And the reason inflation rises is because there needs to be a higher amount of money going to the government in order for the government to supply the citizens with the everyday resources they need to survive. This is the mark of a society which cannot advance past its current financial structure, one that has hit a dead end. And because of its failure to understand the needs of its citizens, as it's clearly taxing them more and taking away more of their money while giving nothing back, the actual resources it promises never go to the citizens. Well, they do, but only to the 1%, or even less than 1% in some cases, because this is called a regressive tax. A regressive tax, unlike a progressive tax, favors the rich at the expense of the poor, because they believe that the rich have somehow earned their stay at such a high hierarchy, at such a point at which they're receiving millions of dollars a year due to the fact that, well, they maintained a position and they didn't fall down to the ladder. Just because you get rich, and you have to understand this, doesn't mean you earned it, doesn't mean that you actually did the work or contributed to society meaningfully that got you into the position that you're currently in. For number 6, I pick the US bombing of North Korea. Taking course over the years of 1950 to 1953, the bombing was carried out against the government of North Korea, its towns, its cities, its metropolitan areas, and intentionally targeting civilians and wiping out the Korean population. The United States didn't want to go to war by employing troops to, on a ground field, attack the citizens and destroy the government. Instead, they used the sneaker tactic of bombing them out of nowhere, when there was not an escalation to begin with, even though North Korea and South Korea always had their disputes and arguments. The US was nowhere to be found in this debate. America, as capitalistic as it is, worried over a socialist threat from East Asia, decided to completely destroy the capital city of Pyongyang, and with it, 400,000 to 600,000 innocent civilians were killed in this bombing, multiple bombings of which were carried out over the years by US veterans, people considered heroes in the eyes of the West. It took the government years to rebuild from the rubble. It did not, however, despite killing thousands and thousands of civilians, kill any of the major politicians. The leader, and all his advisors completely unharmed, continued to build and fashion a nuclear society based upon the ideal of toppling the American government. This originally came about when the leader of North Korea hypothesized about a different economic system than one traditionally used in the Western world, a mixture of certain elements from many economic theories, but one from Karl Marx, very important as it stood out from all the rest. This idea became more dominant, the ideology of North Korea, its concepts, its components, until it became a variant of socialism, a new, modern ideology, a mixture, but in turn, something completely different. The US government, fearing this would destroy the West, just like the Soviet Union had been doing, took action, and as you know, killed hundreds of thousands, assaulting a country that had absolutely nothing to do with the US, that had at no point threatened the US. For number 5, I picked the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide was a genocide carried out in 1994 between the major ethnic groups of Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus were the majority while the Tutsis were the minority. The Hutus, angered that the Tutsis were allowed in political roles, had better economic standings, and were originally favored in representation by the Belgian government, which governed it as a colony during the colonial times in Africa, decided to rebel against the Tutsis, and from it, many massacres occurred in 1994. Widespread sexual assault, human rights violations, and mutilation. The genocide, carried out by Hutu identity extremists, wiped out roughly 70% of the ethnic Tutsi population. Being a small country, the Tutsis had nowhere to hide, and they were slaughtered with machetes by the Hutus who came for them. An estimated 500,000 to 1 million dying from the conflict, both Hutus and Tutsis. Hutu extremists killed moderate Hutus, who opposed the genocide and the violence committed against the Tutsi people. The cause for hatred of the Tutsi people by the Hutus was due to different financial earnings. This was because Tutsi immigrants from foreign countries would enter into the state and increase economic inequality, because they were intentionally employed in certain sectors because of their already high earnings that were found prior to their employment. meaning that the government of Rwanda was intentionally hiring well-paid Tutsis, extra education, have bigger roles, those who have gotten themselves in higher-paying positions beforehand to enter into many political fields that the Hutus despised, because seeing an ethnic minority rule the majority, the ethnic majority, the Hutus, it was an agony for them, and that's completely understandable. Nobody wants to see a different genetic population ruling over them, especially not one that's mixed race. Ahem. But anyway, the Tutsis were mostly annihilated, the remaining population who survived moving as refugees to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At least that's what it's known today. At the time it was called Zaire. Fleeing the violence and the rape, and there was quite a lot of rape, between 250,000 to 500,000 rapes committed against Tutsi women by Hutu extremists. The nation of Rwanda no longer became a nation. Instead, it merely became a settlement of land. Its government having supported the genocide against its ethnic minority. The culture completely dissolved at this point, with nothing but blood, agony, sweat, tears, and misery existing in the state. There was no cultural identity at that point. Its new identity became a country of genocide, mass murder, slaughter, rape, mutilation, and depravity. And today is one of the saddest countries to exist, having some of the most miserable people on the earth. And the people themselves, the Rwandans, of every ethnicity, are beautiful people. The ethnic Bantus, of which most of them are, the Hutus and Tutsis both being Bantu ethnic groups, it was simply a case of not wanting to live with people that are different. And that's completely reasonable. The Hutus had their own culture, had their own history, their own language, their own identity that they did not want to share with a completely different ethnic group. They were their own people, and they loved being with their own people, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. The problem is genociding the other ethnic group. That is the problem, and it ruined everything for everyone. Anything they had going for them at the time, it's now gone, and the country's still recovering after such a nightmare, such a slaughter. This just goes to show how corrupt a government can be, to the point where it can genocide hundreds of thousands of its own people. It's especially scary seeing it came out of nowhere. There was no escalation leading up to it. Sure, there was a bit of dispute between which territories should be preserved for the Hutus and which ones for the Tutsis, and alongside other ethnic minorities in Rwanda, but the genocide part, nobody expected violence, let alone something on such a disgustingly large scale. This is the problem with ethnic diversity. If the Hutus had their own state, a microstate, and the Tutsis had one as well, there would be no problem. But because the government forced them to live together, well, this is what happens. May this be a lesson, as many other countries are struggling with ethnic and racial diversity, and due to the fact that they've lumped together these different groups, well, what do you expect? Because history hasn't learned, unfortunately, there's only going to be more and more of this depravity. Number 4. Democracy. Democracy is inherently a failed system. This is because it's based upon the appeal to popularity fallacy. Or, in other words, 7.6 billion wrongs don't make a right. Just because something is popular and agreed upon by the majority of a nation doesn't mean it's right. This is something that's considered liberating, or free in the Western world, something considered a Western value, particularly in the United States of America. But what's so free about democracy? All it is getting to vote. It's not actually making a decent change. We're not talking about direct democracy or presidential democracy or simply voting in a political party. This has to do with something that is right or wrong based upon the majority of the votes. Let's say that 80% of a country vote for one policy and the 20% don't. They vote against it. That means that 20% are stuck in a country where the 80% of the population are actually against their core beliefs. This means that there's going to be heaps of social societal divide between populations. This means there's going to be ideological separation and segregation, which is what you see in the context of the United States. There are blue states and there are red states, and there are people that divide themselves into these states because they want to be with people that share the same ideology as them. And that's completely fine, but there is no united ideology. With democracy, nobody has any beliefs that they share in common. It's just free ground. Apparently, it's meant to be liberating and free and democratic, that there are people that think differently, that freedom of speech is a valued item. You need to have some quality control in your nation. You need people to have a shared ideology, a shared system of beliefs, a shared philosophy. If you do not have this, your country, through conflict between its civilians, will tear itself apart. We've seen this many times in the past, when there are different forces, there are different factions and rebel groups that fight against the government, because their beliefs alter from that of the states, because they have a different mindset from what their government wants them to have. And this conflict, this struggle, is all because there's no quality control for ideological views, when there really needs to be. And in a democracy, the entire point is that you get to vote. You get to vote, you get to choose, you get to pick which certain law you want passed or don't want passed. You're not supposed to have that. No society that is successful would ever have that. And that's not a good thing in any facet. You have to understand that when a people come together, they unite. They're united by a shared bloodline, maybe a religion, a spirituality. They're also united by an ideology. Maybe a political one, maybe a moral one, but it's an ideology nonetheless. And democracy completely dismantles that and leaves it in chaos instead, the state. And as the state goes up in a blaze, well, you know who's to blame. The people. Because the people had different beliefs. Because the people will have different beliefs, unless you create nations specific for people with those beliefs to go back to. This is why countries like Israel, for example, don't allow a vote such as, should we ban Judaism in our country? Because that's ridiculous. That's the problem with democracy. There's also another problem with democracy, which is that it's an argument to moderation. Most political parties that get big, especially within the Western world, tend to be very center. It's either center-left or center-right. And because of this, because it's so much in the middle, there's no actual variation outside of that. You just got people voting for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and that's it. What about all the other hundreds of political parties that actually ran in every American election? What about them? They don't even get a consideration. Most people don't even know there's more than two political parties. That's just because people, due to being very centered and not adventurous, playing it safe, will only pick between the two. Will only pick the most moderate that there is. And that really discredits any political party with actual motive, with actual meaningful change it could make, because people will only vote for what is popular and not what is moral. That there is the fatal flaw of a democratic system. Another problem with democracy is that people who campaign for democracy usually don't actually like democracy. Hitler was democratically elected. Does that mean that everything he will do will be great for the country? Of course not. Just because somebody is legally elected and gets in completely fair based upon the votes of the people doesn't mean he or she deserves to be in that position because of the votes they receive. Again, this just has to do with most people agreeing with a certain person being elected, not that certain person being elected worthy of even being in such a position to begin with. Another problem with democracy is that it goes against ethnic and racial identity. For instance, in colonial times in Africa, people of African descent clearly did not want people of European descent ruling over them. The same way nobody of European descent, no country comprised predominantly of Europeans, would want somebody of any other ethnicity or any other race ruling over them. They wouldn't want that, and it's completely reasonable because they want somebody elected, somebody who is the president, the dictator, whatever the case may be, to represent them, to relate to them, to be the closest resemblance to them. That's the whole point of having an appointed judge, somebody who makes the laws. You don't want to be governed by somebody who is against your core interests, and that is the problem of diversity, because you inherently have different groups, because since they're inherently different, they will naturally go against one another. They will do things in the disinterest of the other group. And a lot of that has to do with them working towards their own goals for their own group, and these different groups interacting only for the sake of, having no other way of going about their lives. If they could choose a way out of the situation that they were forced into, they definitely would. In the context of, say, Barack Obama, the first mixed-race president of the United States, a lot of people, when it came to voting, a lot of people of African descent who would just see him as simply black, would vote for him because of that. And I know this because the self-proclaimed Republicans who are of African descent, who live within the United States, voted this way too. They voted for Obama despite not agreeing with his policies, but only because of his skin color. That is one of the worst ways a system can be brought up on. by votes with a racial bias, not developed through any communal workings between different groups or interconnected dialogue. None of that. It has nothing to do with trying to find a solution or an individual, in the case of democracy, that best suits everybody's needs. No. It's for the minority to elect somebody against the will of the majority. Unfortunately, that has become the reality. In fact, it's become the reality twice, for both times Barack Obama was elected. I think the best form of government is one that isn't a government. It's one that is governed through a social system, through social engineering, cohesion, and communal cooperation between a shared community, one of a single race, a single ethnicity, one of a single ideology, a religion, not a religion, any of that. It needs to be a homogeneous society, and that society ruled by every individual equally. I believe in a true anarchist utopia, one where no state exists, one where everyone is considered of equal authority, of equal power, rule, and justice. That is the egalitarian line of thought. For number 3, I put fascism on this list. I used to call myself an Italian fascist, because I was ideologically a fascist of Italian descent. Not that I actually lived in Italy, let alone the Italian Empire. I actually live in Australia, and did back then and have all my life. But that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. My core belief system was that if something could be regulated, restricted, for the better health of the people, then it should be. So, for instance, there'd be taxation on unhealthy foods, certain prescription drugs, certain things that would make people of a less desirable genetic quality of life. But of course, that'd be their choice. You're not forcing anything upon anybody. The idea of the fascist mind, how it came about, was through many, many uprisings in European countries, and today has influenced a wide variety of modern thinkers, especially in fields that proclaim to be alt-right or in relation to the Dark Enlightenment. And what I really think is that it goes against human behavior. Now, just to examine what it is, right? If something can be restricted to create a better quality of life, genetic, financial, other, then it must. It is authoritarianism inherently. Like statism, it is only more extreme, a more extreme version of statism. It has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has nothing to do with banning a certain population from your country. There's nothing wrong with that. It's oppressing your population, your country's people, within their own borders, the indigenous population. And fascism inherently is self-discipline. Think of it as the will of a tiger mother, raising her kids to be successful, but at the cost of their own happiness. That's the thing with fascism. Fascism is when you ban all drugs, right? Fascism is where you force your people to do things that they don't want to do that you believe is ultimately going to be best for them. Banning alcohol, banning smoking, banning sex outside of marriage, that kind of thing. Banning anyone pursuing a career in any economic field that the state doesn't perceive to be good for that individual or a group of people within the country's population. That is the nature of fascism. Strictness. And a strictness so intense that anybody within a state's control, a fascist state's control, must bend down to it, or they will receive the worst of punishments, the highest punishments. This is to break the will of the civilians. This is to make them fear the authority, to fear judgment, justice, whatever it may be, that governs over them. Now, even though I disagree with the fundamental philosophy of fascism, I do think it has been implemented in some good places. For instance, my favorite country, Saudi Arabia, has it implemented perfectly, because there has to be fascist laws in order to keep the Islamic character, the faith, the culture alive. If anything, Saudi Arabia doesn't go far enough in its devotion to Sharia law. However, I don't want an Islamic state. In fact, I want a state where there are no individuals of the Abrahamic religion in it. I don't very much like Abrahamic religions. However, I believe that everyone should have the right to have their ultra-fascist Abrahamic religious state dedicated to any of the religions, or all the religions, or whatever you want, whatever mixture it is, because there needs to be one of everything. Everybody should be able to get their will. So, Muslims, Islamists, they want a Sunni Muslim state with full-blown Sharia law. Completely fine with me. If anything, that is what I love about Saudi Arabia. Because it's so out there. It's not in a pill to moderation. It's a monarchy. It's the most traditionalist, rather conservative, anti-liberal state there is. And even though I do like certain liberal values, and I would never have any of the ultra-conservative values Saudi Arabia has in my state, it works for that state. That's what a Muslim state should be. And of course Islam has the right to exist. It just does not have the right to imperialism, colonialism, and to infringe upon people in other countries, and their governments, and the people who live there who advocate for freedom, for secularism, for the expulsion of Muslims from their lands. They don't want to live with Muslims the same way Muslims don't want to live with non-believers. That's as simple as that. And that's what I really like about Saudi Arabia. It's the perfect place for any true Islamist, any real true devout Muslim to go. And I wish the best for Saudi Arabia. However, I don't want the rest of the world to have the same laws as Saudi Arabia. Fascism is an advocate of imperialism, of colonialism, of taking over other countries because they believe those countries to be of lower moral standards. It's a very objective black and white look at morality and what is good and what is bad and who is the heroes and who are the villains. And that's what I don't like at all about fascism. Fascism is a very individualistic ideology, a rejection of traditional collectivism, but in its implementation, a lot of the time it is rather ethnocentric. It appears to be a rather large contradiction to the National Socialist ideology, alongside any ideology which also advocates for nationalism, because you can't have nationalism and imperialism at the same time. The two are contradictions. They're against one another, they're the opposites. One is advancing and taking over other land at the expense of one's own land, and the other is taking care of one's own country and caring about one's own people, not caring about what happens on the other side of the fence. So, fascist Italy to me is the opposite, the direct opposite of a nationalistic society. The Italian Empire cared so little for its own people that it spread out to East Africa, to take Ethiopia, to take Somalia, to take another one in North Africa, Libya. It went ahead and tried to colonize all these different states at the expense financially and morally, spiritually even, to Italy itself. Because if it really did care about the Italian people, the ideology of Italian fascism, Benito Mussolini's ideology, the people, the fascists, the regime, then they wouldn't go ahead and colonize all these other territories because they'd be too busy caring for their own people, building them up, achieving a true Roman Italy. And so, because they disregarded their own people, they lost the Second Italiano-Ethiopian War, and they deserved it. You went ahead and decided to mess with the culture, the people, the finance of Ethiopia. You attacked the Ethiopian Empire. You killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Ethiopians and destroyed so much other property because you wanted to capture that, you wanted to expand your empire. And I get the idea of an empire, right? You want to bring something good into the rest of the world. But you have to understand not everybody wants to abide by the same rules. People are inherently different. Ethiopians, Italians, they are inherently different. And because of your disregard for racial identity or ethnic identity or caring for one's own people, it's just a spread out globalist agenda really, because that's what fascism is when combined with imperialism. It becomes this rather un-ethnocentric, rather rejecting ideology of the people, and the belief that you need to help others. Now don't get me wrong, it's great to help others, it's great to give to charity, I understand that. But when you take over another country by force, you're not recommending how to manage their banks, how to manage their wealth, well, that's completely immoral and downright disgusting. No wonder the Italian Empire fell apart, because there was so little regard to caring for the Italian people and more for caring what people did and who people were in East Africa. And this is one of the major problems of colonialism, and the whole idea of colonial rule as a concept. It never works. The same way with capitalism. Maybe some people have good ideas of how to have, big wealth, big civilization, all the materialism that they perceive themselves to desire. It never works out. It doesn't work out for the millions of people that die every year in pretty much slave labory, and that's what it is, okay? When you force somebody to work, that is called slavery. Because if they don't work, well, how are they going to get anywhere in a capitalist society? You need money, don't you? And that's what it is, inherently capitalism. It's a form of slavery. In other words, it's a form of murder. Only legal murder, so I guess it's not murder, it's killing, but you know what I mean. If Hitler really cared about improving the Third Reich, he wouldn't go ahead and deprive other countries of their own people, like Poland, for instance, and other countries in Europe. He wouldn't start a war with the Soviet Union. He wouldn't need to be involved in all that because he'd be too occupied taking care of Germany. And for what it was worth, when Germany was under Adolf Hitler's rule, yeah, it was the best country in the world, but he messed it up and he killed heaps of innocent people. Millions and millions of innocent people, because he sought to take away their freedom. Why should they give him the freedom to take care of his own people if he can't do the same for others? If he can't let them be with their own kind? Look, the problem with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini wasn't that they cared about their people, wasn't that they raised their people up and created these beautiful nationalistic identities for them. That was great. That was the greatest triumphs. They ultimately cared about their people. They just didn't show it through their actions, which I find to be a big problem. Making Germany all German, making Italy all Italian, these are great things. These are great ideas. The problem with these fascist regimes is that they didn't allow Poland to be for the Polish. They didn't allow Ethiopia to be for the many indigenous ethnic groups of Ethiopia. They didn't do the same for Libya, they didn't do the same for Somalia, and because of their fascism, their imperialism, their empires fell to ruins. Their empires shouldn't be empires. There shouldn't be such thing as an empire to begin with. There should be nation-states, ethno-states. There should not be empirical states that infringe upon the rights of others. If somebody is not infringing upon your rights, you don't judge them. If they don't judge you, you don't judge them. There shouldn't be a problem. But because of the judgment, because of the hatred, you go out of your way to ruin the lives of others, believing that you're improving their lives, when in reality you're not at all. And this is the fatal flaw of fascism, because it comes with this self-righteous narcissism that everything somebody does must be objectively correct, that it must be objectively moral, that everyone beneath them must be worthless, must be completely evil, must be parasites leeching off of them. When in reality, they're coming to their countries, they're colonizing these countries, they're taking them over, they're ruining them, they're causing their economy to crash, they're making them go through many financial recessions, and then they're claiming, well, we're superior, we have a better government, we have a better national identity, we have better people. You don't care about that because you only care about what's happening in other countries, not your own. If anything, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini were anti-nationalists. They were pretty much globalists, they were internationalists, they were multiculturalists even, if you want to go that far. And so you fail the ideology of nationalism when you put it with fascism, because you can only hold your race or your ethnic group or your people or whichever national population you want to pick to the collective standards of the statistical averages. You're going to have people who have shortcomings. You're going to have people who achieve more than the average person. You're going to have idiots, you're going to have super geniuses. This is how it is. You can't make everybody a super genius. It doesn't work, especially when you consider regression to the mean, because the offspring intelligent parents will inevitably have will become undoubtedly less intelligent as each generation passes. Regression to the mean cannot be eradicated unless you have some incredible science which can just fix this. But you didn't really invent any of that, did you? You didn't contribute to science in that category. It was just measuring gypsy skulls. Consider standard deviation when it comes to intelligence tests. For instance, IQ by race or ethnicity or ethnic cluster, that kind of thing. You're going to inevitably have stupid people. Yes, you're going to inevitably have ultra-smart people. You just have to accept that a group can only be held to the standards of that group. You can't just select the most intelligent of that group and then say, alright, well, this is my empire. No. What you need to do is that you need to realize that people sometimes fail in life. There's genetic determinism, and you have to live with it. You have to live with the bad of living in a state where you live off of nothing that isn't indigenous to the state, to the land, to the native land that your people live on. You have to accept that. There are good things and there are bad things of accepting complete ultranationalism, complete ethno-nationalism. That is how it is. However, you cannot go to another country and then demand you have to be like Italians, or you have to be like Germans, or whatever. That there is wrong on so many levels. It's actually rather inhumane, if I may say so. You don't need to be a fascist in order to get a decent quality of life inside of your state. What you need is to pick the best demographic, the demographic that resembles you the best, and say, alright, we're not perfect, but human beings aren't perfect. What we're going to do is that we're going to do our best with what we have, what we can work with, our genetic population. We're going to love one another, we're going to love our culture, we're going to be ultra-ethnocentric, we're going to love our own identity, and we're going to believe that we're better than everyone else. But because we love ourselves so much, we don't want to go improving the lives of others. Why would we want to do that? I thought we cared about our own people so much. And so fascism, implemented and in moral theory, is both a terrible ideology. People don't want to be living in chains. They don't want to be shackled by an authoritarian, extremely oppressive government. They want freedom. And libertarians, maybe libertarian socialists, in the case of myself, want a society that's fair and egalitarian for everyone. That's the whole principle of egalitarianism. Is that so wrong? To want everybody of a very homogeneous demographic to have equal rights? I understand the problem and the many problems and the plagues of living in diversity and with people that are completely different from you. But you're supposed to have a very homogeneous state where everybody is the same. They think the same, they're genetically the same. That's who they are. They love one another. They want to support one another financially, in terms of friendship, whatever the case may be. Fascism ruins this love triangle. Fascism ruins this certain love, this certain ethnocentric, European, African, East Asian, Aboriginal, Polynesian, whatever race you want to pick, Arab, whatever. It erases this love that people have for their own people. And that is why fascism should never, ever be implemented. Why states should be free, they shouldn't even have a government to begin with, and people should rely on one another. They don't need private property. No, everybody shares the wealth. Everybody shares the same items. Property is a form of theft, the same way capitalism is a form of legal killing. That is the problem with the state, with capitalism, in its inherent nature. The same goes for fascism. Equally horrible. You need a society where people are liberated by their choices to get better, not that they're forced to get better, because we need to help each other out. You don't go to a friend and demand that they conform to your conformist views or your way of life or what you inject into your body or whatever it is, right? Who you interact with. No. At best you can recommend people to live their life the way you see fit. But you cannot force them. You cannot force anybody to do anything. And you shouldn't. All you can do is force people to live in your state. And you should be doing that. You should keep them in your state and make them love living in your state. Because you've created a beautiful, beautiful nation. And no nation is beautiful under the rule of fascism.
You'll get His Majesty completely alone on one channel and the UN translator alone on the other, and you can do whatever you want with it afterwards. So here is His Majesty's address to the United Nations General Assembly.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, 27 years ago, as Emperor of Ethiopia, I mounted a rostrum in Geneva, Switzerland, to address to the League of Nations an appeal for relief from the destruction which had been unleashed against my defenseless nation by the fascist invader.
It is good that you are here to record this picture of me in my palace garden at Addis Ababa. People who see this throughout the world will realize that even in the 20th century, with faith, courage, and a just cause, David will still beat Goliath.
With the beginning of the European migrant crisis in 2015, otherwise traditionally European countries were completely swarmed with foreign residents, most of whom didn't actually acquire a proper citizenship and were merely granted one by the governments of the European continent. Nobody wants to live with somebody who has completely different values from them. And as we see with religious conflict, Christians and Muslims, that's pretty much the case with Europe right now, especially within Western Europe. In fact, the more westernized and wealthy a country has become, the more likely it is to take in refugees, and thus the continent has started a rape crisis. The thing is, no matter how much people claim to love diversity, people will self-segregate naturally, organically. The tables fold once again in evolutionary order. People want to escape people completely different from them, and so, as you can tell by neighborhoods, everyone segregates naturally. Whether it's immediate or not, it will eventually happen. The problem is a little thing called Section 8 housing. Now, if you don't know about Section 8 housing, well, I'm very sorry to tell you this, and it's horrible, but it's when a very poor population who live in low-income neighborhoods, say in the context of the United States, so we're talking about the New World here, these people will be moved, transported to high-income neighborhoods. So, they don't need to undergo gentrification or anything like that. They don't need to improve their neighborhoods. No, they're just transported to another neighborhood, one more high earning than them. So you have predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods, where the neighborhoods suddenly become empty because all the people have now moved to a predominantly European one. And this is the thing, they're forcing diversity through this lens of trying to justify it as a social security thing. When in reality, these people, making far less money than the rest of the population, particularly Europeans and Asians and Jews, with Amerindians also dipping below the average medium income for American citizens, haven't the right to move into high-income neighborhoods when they don't even make the medium amount of money. So they're getting social security benefits more, despite working less and earning less and contributing to the economy less. Well, that's just great. Now people are forced to live with people they don't want. There's nothing wrong with wanting to live with people that are like you. People like to share an ideology, but they also like to share an ancestry. In some cases, it's a racial ancestry. And people will identify with those who are closest to them, who have the same character as them, the same personalities as them, those who they can relate to because they've been brought up with these people, but also because there's just a genetic ethnocentric bond between them. And they like that. They don't want to live with some group of people or a bunch of groups of people that are completely different from them. And because of this, crime rates have risen. It's the same with Pakistanis in the United Kingdom. It's the same with South Asian immigrants there. It's killing freedom of association. Diversity is another plague that, for some reason, is only getting worse. Mainly because people can't muster up the will to say, no, enough is enough. England should be for the English. Pakistan should be for the Pakistanis. Japan should be for the Japanese. Ethiopia for the Ethiopians. Liberia for the Liberians. And the Netherlands for the Dutch. That's simply how it should go. And there's nothing wrong with that. But unfortunately, people will disguise this situation as just a simple attempt of getting poor people into high-income neighborhoods, trying to get them out of poverty. Well, it doesn't work. Because these people don't magically get wealthier just because they live in a high-income neighborhood. They don't get better job opportunities. They go back to making the same amount of money. You're not lifting anybody out of poverty. You're just placing them back into poverty in an area they do not belong. So that was 9 reasons so far as to why we should abolish the state. But what about the last one? Well, before I get to that, I want to include some honorable mentions. The Bangladeshi genocide. This was a genocide carried out against the religious Hindu minority in East Pakistan by Islamist militant groups that was backed by the East Pakistani government. The US supported this because they wanted to have good relationships with Pakistan, seeing East Pakistan was going to become Bangladesh. It was a war for independence, a liberation war, as India had adopted a constitutional socialist approach to its governmental policies. So yes, the United States actually supported the death of possibly 3 million people. Congratulations, US, you're definitely against human rights violations, I can tell. Border disputes between different countries. Governments fight over which land should belong to which state. A major example of this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And for those wondering, I'm actually a Zionist, but I believe that Palestine should become its own independent nation. So I'm also a Palestinian nationalist. I believe in a two-state solution. It's just a shame that the Palestinian territories don't abide by this. They want it all. So, because of their imperialism, hey, they're gonna get colonized. It's their fault. The war in Iraq and Syria, regarding Kurdistan's independence, the government's brush with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and so forth. That's another problem with having a government. You're going to have rebel groups who rise up against you. The same can be said about the French Revolution. The school system, forcing kids to go to school so they can learn nothing for 12 years, and then go on to receive nothing that they couldn't have already achieved just by being educated on a few basic rules when it comes to having a job. This also includes universities, and people who fund universities just to give people more education that they don't need, wasting more years of their life, learning absolutely nothing that they couldn't have learned on their own, in their own spare time, and wasting everybody's money. The fucking opioid crisis. Prescription drugs that do nothing but relieve pain. They don't even cure a disease or an illness you have, and are killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, especially men. It turns out that white Americans are more likely to be prescribed opioids, so they have the highest death rate due to the fact that idiot doctors are doing immoral practices in which, for no better reason than simple pain removal, right? Not even curing anybody, not even fixing anything, just simply taking away some pain, right? It's basically just something you inject into yourself to take away the physical agony. Even though that agony, that pain's not going to kill you, it's going to be over very quickly anyway. You're killing tens of millions of people a year because they get addicted to opioids. Not their fault at all, but because doctors are prescribing people opioids. And without their consent, a lot of the time, they're injecting opioids into their system. This is disgusting. This is depraved. You're telling me that tens of thousands of people die every year in one of the most westernized countries in the world simply because you haven't learned that a drug that is killing this many people is bad. I mean, you know it is bad, but you're gonna still do it because you're disgusting. Your government is evil. I mean, really, I'm here to just ask the question, why hasn't somebody nuked this country already? I'm serious. Why isn't some country nuked America at this point? This is insane that it gets away with this many human rights violations. Now, you may be wondering, before I get into it, you may be wondering why I brought up the Holodomor from before as number 9 on this list. And well, the thing is that, even though I know it seems like I'm procrastinating to get to the final point, but I'll get to that, that is an example of capitalism killing people, not socialism, not communism. Firstly, let's establish that communism has not been implemented in a civilizational sense. In a primitive sense, in a good sense, meaning in the context of hunter-gatherers who share meat equally, who share vegetables and all kinds of food equally, resources that they find and gather, that they hunt and gather. You know how it is. Yes, that is called primitive communism, and I support that, being an anarcho-primitivist. However, in the context of civilization, socialism, if anything, is just an improvement upon capitalism, because in socialist societies, you still have capitalism. Capitalism is just inherently the exchange of items, right? Or currency, or anything like that. It's economic exchange. And in order to have materialism, the things people perceive they desire, but in reality they actually don't, as materialism makes people less happy, the more materialistic and consumerist they are, you can't have this materialism that you have in Western civilization. Why did I say Western civilization? I meant all of civilization, ever, since the dawn of civilization, without capitalism, without jobs, without economic exchange. So, what socialism is a transition, a gradual one, an eventual one, to primitive communism. It gets people into the swing of things, so they can make the transition on their own. So, them, alongside the rest of mass society, the populous places, can eventually become primitive. And you may think that's crazy, or, oh, I'm just playing up a meme ideology. Well, I mean, you're not wrong, but it doesn't discredit the actual ideology itself. nor the argumentation used to justify a return to hunter-gatherer lifestyles. It's all about happiness, and happiness is completely drained from materialism and capitalism. Nobody wants an economy. We want to be free, like we were for most of human existence. That's how it worked out for most of the time the human species has been on Earth, believe it or not. It may seem crazy, and yes, it is a big turnover, obviously, but I'm not going to force anybody to do anything. If you want to go back to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, with me, like I do, great, you can come along. If you don't want that, I'm not going to force anybody. Guess what? I'm against imperialism. I'm completely anti-imperialism. Unlike the United States, I respect each state's right to do whatever the hell it wants, without restriction, without regulation. However, in the context of the economy, socialism regulates things for the sake of providing the best quality to the customers, to the employees, and to everyone else. In between, outside of that spectrum, socialism sees that the rich don't get richer from exploiting the poor, by keeping them poor on tiny wages, and by hiring hundreds of them so that the employers reap all the benefits. Despite the fact that the employers, the bosses of these big industrial industries, barely work, they get paid the most, as opposed to the workers, who should own the means of production. However, if you are to have a state, I would recommend that the state does seize the means of production, because that is an efficient way of grabbing them, of managing private property, by turning it into public property, state property. Community-driven, non-state property, which is also public property, means property belongs to everyone. My house is your house. That's because we share a bond and we love one another. We like each other. We have shared values. And even if we don't know each other, we know that we share the same ideology and the same ancestry. And that is all that matters, because we're taught to be nice to one another. And if we're not, then we're expelled out of the nation. Simple as that. That's a successful, bright, good nation. That is the true revolutionary utopian model for me. And my philosophy, the one I made, utopianism, is about non-interventionalism with other countries. It's each state to fend for their own people. And there's a lot of beauty in that ultra-nationalistic ideal for a planet. When millions of people died in Ukraine under Soviet rule, it was capitalism, because they were exhausted, they were worked. They weren't going to provide the citizens with basic living standards, with food, with shelter, with cures for diseases and illnesses. No, they wanted to kill them. And the reality is, unfortunately, that this is what capitalism is. It's murder, just legal murder. Let's think about this, right? Slavery should be considered murder. Absolutely. But that's what capitalism is. A slave in the conventional sense, historically how it's used in most contexts, refers to somebody who doesn't have the choice to work. But that's everyone in a capitalist society. You don't choose to really work, do you? Sure, you could not work, you can do that. But how do you get anywhere? You need an income in order to have anything. Would you prefer begging on the streets? Even that is a form of work, since you have to collect coins. So, what do? Well, the only way to really get away from it is to go into the woods and start the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And that's great, but the problem is people need something to help them transition. When you're brought up in materialism and capitalism, and you're used to material needs, it's practically impossible to do such a thing. It's like if you've smoked for years, and then somebody says, give it up, it's easy. Of course it's not. You've developed an addiction. An unhealthy one, nonetheless, but an addiction that you cannot break. But you can break it. It's just incredibly difficult to do so. So when I hear people saying, oh, look at these slaves, they had it so bad. No, they didn't. Everyone is enslaved under capitalism. A slave is somebody who doesn't choose to work. Somebody who's forced to work. A non-slave is somebody who's technically not forced to work, but unless they want to walk into the woods, if they live anywhere in civilization, the same way slaves do, well, they have to work. So, there is practically no difference between a slave and a non-slave. The only difference is, conventionally, slaves had it better, believe it or not. They were fed, meaning that they weren't exploited, and they were guaranteed food. They have a 0% unemployment statistic, and they're automatically given private property. At no point do they have to actually buy their own houses. They're bought by the state. They're provided by their bosses, the ones who enslave them. On top of this, in the context of American slavery, usually working as a slave was less dangerous, while working as a non-slave was incredibly dangerous because it forced you to do non-conventional jobs, while being a slave gave you full range of simple cotton-picking fields. And that was basically it. There was a bit of construction work in a few cases, but that was very rare, and when that did happen, usually slaves were given fair amounts of breaks, and a fair amount to eat and drink, and all that kind of stuff. Another good thing about slaves is that they were less likely to be killed. The reason for this is that a lot of free African Americans who got out of slavery and became free Negroes actually bought other enslaved Africans. And they did this to protect them, because when they started enslaving them, people started seeing them as private property. And that's what you are, you're the state's private property. Not going to attack a slave. Nobody goes and attacks a slave. There's a way higher chance of you being raped and murdered and robbed from as a non-slave than a slave. And so this cycle of free Negroes going out and taking care of enslaved Africans by buying them and then holding them hostage, but in a way that creates a friendship, in a way that creates a bond, a relationship between them in a positive light. They're protecting them. They're paying for their expenses. That's basically how it is. That was a means of survival for them. And it was a good means of survival. But it's a shame that has to be the way it is in a capitalist civilization. I wish things could be different, but unfortunately that's just how they are. So the Holodomor, Mao's China, these are examples of capitalism killing tens of millions of people. Not communism, not socialism, working them to death. In a communist society, there's not even an economy. So how could that possibly be a result of communism? We hear this statement over and over again. I hear this statement at least. Communism killed 100 million people. It's the greatest evil ever put on the earth. It's a left-wing plague. No, it's not. What it is a door one needs to open in order to get away from the actual plague. One perpetrated by mainly conservatives, Republicans, who advocate for this laissez-faire, capitalist, Ayn Randian, objectivist system. And what it is, inherently, is death. Death for everyone involved. And so Mao's China, the Holodomor, the gulags in Russia, all that stuff, rule under Stalin, everyone that has died from communism, not actual communism as we've already discussed, it's never been actually implemented in a civilizational sense. They've died from capitalism, from being overworked, for having to serve for the common good, for the larger part of society. They didn't work for themselves, they worked for bosses. In fact, they entirely worked for bosses. And if the capitalist class structure was never established, none of this would have happened. So, if any ideology has killed 100 million people, it's laissez-faire capitalism.
Okay. Without further ado, the worst thing ever committed by any state, the worst atrocity committed by a government in human history. Warning, this one is it's rather dark, even for this list. Number 1.
The Vietnam War.
This historical event in history, this conflict between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States of America, gets brought up quite frequently when people discuss communism-based conflicts, when they discuss wars in relation to certain enforcements of economic policies. And I agree that it is completely wrong to force your will on others. I understand why South Vietnam would want to distance itself from North Vietnam. It's reasonable, and I don't think that at any point South Vietnam was expecting America to intervene in this conflict. Think of it as Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan broke away from Sudan because of religious conflicts. South Sudan is predominantly Christian, while Sudan, being in North Africa, is predominantly Muslim. And from what you'd expect, people get along better with people that are like them. So this is why you have the communism-backed rebels in North Vietnam, and you have the more capitalistic, laissez-faire kind in South Vietnam. Now, regardless of my political bias, of course I'm going to favor North Vietnam, it's rather irrelevant to this case. If North Vietnam were the capitalist one, and were the one being invaded by the United States, I'd have the exact same reaction. Now, of course, I wouldn't agree with North Vietnam, due to the fact that I support socialism, but it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what I support. I could support fascism. For I kid, really, it's irrelevant. What I do not support, under any circumstances, is imperialism. And in the other examples I've given you, an example being the bombing of North Korea, at the very least it was true that North Korea was preparing to go to war with South Korea. And you have to understand that there's been a massive divide over the years. Because after Japan colonized it, well, of course, they've gotten separate identities. In fact, nobody will at any point compare North Korea to South Korea in a cultural manner, only in an economic manner, and say, oh, okay, North Korea is pretty much a dead country, because they point to the extremely low GDP and other ways of identifying an impoverished country. However, as I said, it's irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. The United States went ahead and, well, does what the United States does best. Kill a lot of people, kill a lot of Vietnamese people, go into their land, kill hundreds of thousands, kill millions of them, in a massive slaughter, one of the largest slaughters in human history, simply because a faction of a country, again, a faction of a country, we're not even talking about the whole country, we're not even talking about the whole state of North Vietnam, because they had a different ideology from the United States. Now, of course, it is true that North Vietnam and South Vietnam were at war with one another, but unlike North Korea and South Korea, it's completely different. They're basically one country. You can split it any which ways. If a certain group of people start attacking another group of people, and it happens to be a mutual thing, they both agreed upon it, well, that's completely fine. You leave the two groups alone. You don't intervene. In the case of the Vietnam War, however, and most unfortunately, it makes sense to unite the two individual states. Unlike North Korea, where it's pretty clear that the two groups cannot live together, North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese were the same. There's no difference. Today, Vietnam is ruled under what is considered a socialist party, or at the very least, the Socialist Party proclaims to be socialist, whatever it thinks it is, right? So America's deeds of, intervening didn't even do anything. But for the sake of pointing this out, even if it did, even if it changed everything, these millions of people that died in this massive slaughter, with many human rights violations carried out by the United States against innocent Vietnamese civilians, what did you achieve? What positive thing did you contribute to the country? Nothing. Nothing at all. And it will be forever scarred because of this. Unlike North Korea, where you can understand people's motives for intervening, because North Korea threatens other countries. I mean, it didn't threaten the US at the time, but it's the US, it's a horrible, horrible state, but whatever. You can understand that North Korea clearly wants to completely destroy South Korea. While North Vietnam and South Vietnam, there has to be unity between the two. One has to take over the other. And even if that means through force, it's completely reasonable to understand this because North Vietnam and South Vietnam are basically one country. They just need to be united under one government. This is different from, say, South Sudan and Sudan, because they've distanced themselves culturally. They've distanced themselves so much because they knew they couldn't be together. Not everyone in North Vietnam supported communism. Not everyone in South Vietnam supported capitalism. But the United States didn't care anyway. And look what happened. This is American freedom to you. No. I'm not done yet. add insult to injury, the troops who were sent to Vietnam were sent by force, through conscription. So all those American soldiers who died, they didn't even get the choice to die. They were forced because the American government didn't have loyal followers. Because guess what? People don't want to participate in genocide, which is what the Vietnam War was. And that final reason concludes to the entire point of this list. No matter how much you claim we can do it better next time, build a better state, roll a better government, it's not going to work. This is what they've said hundreds of years ago, when their states failed in the past. Old societies. Ones that nowadays we don't even remember, we don't even talk about. They themselves also claimed that after failing to rule their civilians in peace, if they were given a second chance, they'd do things alternatively. That's what they all say. And they fail, and they fail, and they fail, and the state keeps failing. No matter how much you try to fix a broken system, you can't fix something that's never worked to begin with. A nation can be stateless. It doesn't need a government in order to thrive, in order to work, function, and succeed. I know it's going to be a lot of hard work, going to take a lot of effort. I never said it was going to be an easy job. Nonetheless, it's the only true alternative that can work, that can succeed, that can allow a people to rightfully prosper. And with your assistance, a utopia can be formed.